Jake Morrison had been working cattle ranches across Arizona for 15 years, but he'd never seen country quite like this. The red mesas stretched endlessly under a brutal August sun, and the dust kicked up by his horse seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a dying fire. He was 20 years old, built lean and tough from years in the saddle, with sun-weathered skin and pale blue eyes that most folks said looked like winter ice. The rocking tea ranch sprawled across 30,000 acres of high desert, bordered on three sides by the Navajo Nation. Jake had signed on as the new foreman just 2 weeks ago, replacing old Bill Henderson, who'd taken a bad fall from his horse and decided retirement looked better than another broken bone. The pay was good, better than anywhere else Jake had worked, but he was beginning to understand why the position had been hard to fill. The cowboys who worked the rocking tee were a mixed bunch. There were the usual suspects, white ranch hands from Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico who drifted from job to job following the work. But what made this place different was the significant number of Navajo men who worked the cattle alongside them. The reservation bordered the ranch, and many families had been working these lands long before any white man had claimed ownership. Jake pulled his hat down lower against the sun as he rode toward the north pasture where the crew was gathering strays. His horse, a sturdy paint gelding named Cisco, picked his way carefully through the rocky terrain. In the distance, Jake could see the dust cloud that marked where his men were working. He counted 7 riders moving through the scattered cattle, pushing the animals toward the holding pens near Bitter Creek. As he drew closer, Jake could make out the individual riders. There was Tommy Begay, barely 20 years old but already one of the best ropers Jake had ever seen. Next to him rode his cousin Robert, who could track a wounded steer through country that looked like bare rock to anyone else. The two brothers, Sam and Joe Yazzie, worked in perfect harmony, moving cattle with an almost telepathic understanding of each other's intentions. But it was the 5th rider who caught Jake's attention. The man sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd been born in the saddle, but there was something different about him. He was older than the others, probably in his 60s, with long grey hair tied back and deep lines carved into his weathered face. His name was Thomas Begay, and according to the other ranch hands, he was Tommy's grandfather and something of a legend among the Diné people. Jake had tried to make conversation with Thomas several times since taking over as foreman, but the old man seemed to look right through him. He spoke when spoken to, did his work without complaint, and rode away at the end of each day without a backward glance. The other Navajo cowboys treated him with obvious respect, sometimes speaking to him in their own language before making decisions about the work. This morning, Jake was determined to establish some kind of working relationship with Thomas. As the new foreman, he needed the respect and cooperation of all his men, and Thomas Begay was clearly someone whose opinion carried weight with the others. Jake spurred Cisco into a lope and caught up with the group just as they were pushing the last of the strays toward the creek. The work was nearly done, and the men were beginning to relax in their saddles, talking and laughing if they let their horses walk. "Good work this morning, boys," Jake called out, riding up to the group. "We should have these cattle sorted and back where they belong before the heat gets too bad." Tommy Begay touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Yes, sir, Mr. Morrison. These old cows know where the good grass is. They just sometimes forget where the fence lines are." Jake chuckled and turned his attention to Thomas, who was riding slightly apart from the group. "Thomas, I've been meaning to ask you about that section of fence up by Devil's Rock. Looks like it's been down for a while. Do you know what might have happened to it?" Thomas looked at Jake for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and measured. Fence was cut 3, maybe 4 days ago." "Cut?" Jake frowned. "You mean someone deliberately damaged it? Why would they do that?" "Could be many reasons," Thomas replied, his gaze drifting toward the distant mesas. "Could be someone wanted their cattle to graze on better grass. Could be someone wanted to make a point about boundaries." Jake felt a flash of irritation. The old man's cryptic answers were exactly the kind of thing that made him feel like an outsider. "Well, whatever the reason, we need to get it fixed. I'll send a crew up there this afternoon." "Might want to talk to the tribal police first," Thomas suggested. "Let them know about the fence. Show respect for the process." "The tribal police?" Jake's voice carried a note of impatience. "Thomas, this is ranch business. The fence is on our land, and I'll handle it the way I see fit." For the first time since Jake had known him, Thomas Begay smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or a friendly one. It was the kind of smile a man might wear when he'd just been dealt a winning hand in a high-stakes poker game. The expression made Jake suddenly uncomfortable. though he couldn't quite say why. "Your land," Thomas repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose that's what the papers say." The other cowboys had grown quiet, sensing the tension that was building between their foreman and the old Navajo cowboy. Tommy Begay looked nervous, glancing back and forth between his grandfather and Jake as if he were watching a fuse burn down toward a powder keg. Jake straightened in his saddle, feeling his authority being questioned. "That's right, Thomas. This is Rocking Tea-land, and I'm the foreman here. When I give instructions about ranch work, I expect them to be followed without a lot of discussion about tribal police or showing respect for processes I don't understand." Thomas's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes. The change was subtle, like the moment when a calm dog's hackles begin to rise, but every man present felt it. Even the horses seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, shifting restlessly beneath their riders. "You don't understand much, do you, boy?" Thomas said, his voice still quiet, but carrying a weight that made the words feel heavy as stones. The casual use of "boy" hit Jake like a slap. He was the foreman, a man with responsibilities and authority, and he wasn't about to be talked down to by an aging cowboy who seemed to think his age gave him the right to be disrespectful. "I understand plenty," Jake shot back, his own voice rising. "I understand that I'm the boss here, and when I give an order, I expect it to be followed. I don't need lessons about respect from someone who can't seem to show any to his supervisor." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the whisper of wind through the sagebrush and the distant lowing of cattle. Thomas Begay's smile faded slowly, like sunset shadows creeping across the desert floor. When it was gone completely, the transformation in his face was startling. Gone was the weathered old cowboy who quietly did his work and minded his own business. In his place sat a man whose eyes held depths that Jake suddenly realized he'd been foolish to underestimate. There was intelligence there, and strength, and something else. Something that made Jake think of stories he'd heard about the old days, when the West was still wild and men settled their differences with more than words. "Supervisor," Thomas repeated, tasting the word like it was something bitter. "That's an interesting choice of words, boy." This time, the emphasis on boy was unmistakable, and Jake felt his temper flare. He was tired of walking on eggshells around the cultural sensitivities of his Navajo employees. He was tired of feeling like every word he spoke was being judged by standards he didn't understand. Most of all, he was tired of this old man's attitude. "My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm the foreman of this ranch," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You can call me Mr. Morrison, or you can call me boss, but you're not going to call me boy like I'm some green kid who doesn't know which end of a horse bites." Thomas nodded slowly, as if Jake had just confirmed something he'd suspected all along. "Jake Morrison," he repeated. "Foreman. Boss." He paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. "You know what I call a man who thinks a title makes him important, Jake Morrison?" Jake didn't answer, but his jaw was clenched so tight that a muscle jumped in his cheek. "I call him a fool," Thomas continued, "and I've been dealing with fools like you for more years than you've been breathing." The insult was delivered in the same quiet, measured tone Thomas had been using throughout the conversation, but it hit Jake like a physical blow. He could feel the eyes of the other cowboys on him, waiting to see how their new foreman would handle being called a fool by one of his own men. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward the coiled lariat hanging from his saddle horn, not with any conscious intention, but simply because his body was preparing for conflict. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but Thomas caught it immediately. "You thinking about teaching an old Indian a lesson about respect?" Thomas asked, and now there was genuine amusement in his voice. "That would be interesting to see." Jake forced his hand back to his reins, realizing how close he'd come to making a terrible mistake. Getting into a physical confrontation with an employee, especially a Navajo employee on land that bordered the reservation, would be a disaster that could cost him his job and possibly land him in jail. "I think," Jake said carefully, "that we need to finish this conversation later, when we've both had time to cool down." "No," Thomas said simply. "I think we need to finish it now." The old cowboy swung down from his horse with surprising agility, his movements fluid and controlled despite his age. He stood beside his mount, one hand resting casually on the saddle horn, but Jake could see the coiled strength in his stance. "Get down, boy," Thomas said quietly. "Time you learned something your daddy should have taught you years ago." Jake felt trapped. If he dismounted, he'd be accepting Thomas's challenge to what was clearly going to be a fight. If he stayed in the saddle, he'd look like a coward in front of his men. Neither option was acceptable. but he had to choose one. Thomas, Tommy Begay said nervously, maybe we should just stay out of this, grandson, Thomas said without taking his eyes off Jake. This is between me and the boy here. Jake made his decision. He swung down from Cisco's back, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a sound like a gavel falling. All right, Thomas. You want to do this the hard way? That's fine by me. But understand that when this is over, you're fired. Thomas's smile returned, cold and sharp as a knife blade. When this is over, boy, you're going to understand a few things you never learned before. And the first thing you're going to understand is why everyone around here calls me War Chief. Jake felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the desert wind. War Chief. He'd heard the name whispered among the other cowboys, always with a mixture of respect and something that might have been fear. He'd assumed it was just a nickname, maybe something Thomas had earned during his time in the military. Now, looking into the old man's eyes, Jake realized he'd been wrong about a lot of things. War Chief. Jake tried to keep his voice steady, but he could hear the uncertainty creeping in. That's right, Thomas said, beginning to circle slowly to his left, forcing Jake to turn to keep facing him. Thomas Begay, 1st Battalion, 101st Airborne Division. 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Bronze Star. After that, 20 years with the Navajo Tribal Police, most of it spent dealing with young white men who thought they knew better than their elders.
Jake's mouth went dry.
This wasn't just some old cowboy looking to prove a point. This was a decorated combat veteran with decades of experience in law enforcement, a man who'd probably forgotten more about fighting than Jake had ever learned. Thomas? Jake started, but the old man cut him off. War Chief, Thomas corrected. That's what you'll call me from now on. That, or Mr. Begay. Your choice, boy. The circle Thomas was walking had tightened, bringing him closer to Jake with each step. Jake could see the scars on the old man's hands now, pale lines that spoke of old injuries and hard-won experience. He could see the way Thomas moved, balanced and controlled, like a man who'd learned long ago that violence was sometimes necessary and had made peace with that knowledge. I don't want to fight you, Jake said, and was surprised to discover that he meant it. His anger was draining away, replaced by a growing understanding of just how badly he'd misjudged the situation. No, Thomas agreed. You don't. But you're going to anyway, because that's the only way you're going to learn the lesson you need to learn. What lesson is that? Thomas stopped circling and stood perfectly still, his dark eyes boring into Jake's. That respect isn't something you demand, boy. It's something you earn. And you can't earn it by waving around a title like it's a magic wand that makes you important. Jake looked around at the other cowboys, hoping to find some support or at least sympathy in their faces. What he saw instead was a mixture of anticipation and resignation, as if they'd all been waiting for this moment to arrive. You've all been expecting this, he said, the realization hitting him like cold water. Tommy Begay nodded reluctantly. Yes, sir, Mr. Morrison. We figured it would happen sooner or later. Grandfather doesn't much like being told what to do by men who haven't earned the right to give orders. And you think he has the right to assault his supervisor? I think, said Sam Yazzie quietly, that what's about to happen isn't assault, it's education. Thomas chuckled, a sound like wind through dry leaves. Smart boy, that Sam. Always was the brightest of the bunch. He turned his attention back to Jake. So what's it going to be, Foreman? You going to stand there and take your education like a man? Or you going to run back to the ranch house and call the sheriff? Jake knew he was trapped. If he backed down now, he'd never have the respect of his crew. If he fought and lost, which seemed increasingly likely, he'd be in even worse shape. But at least fighting would show that he wasn't a complete coward. All right, Jake said, raising his hands and settling into what he hoped was a defensive stance. Let's get this over with. Thomas nodded approvingly. Now you're starting to show some sense, boy. Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you any more than I have to. This is about teaching, not killing. The old cowboy moved forward with surprising speed, but Jake was ready for him, or thought he was. Thomas feinted left, and when Jake shifted to block, the older man's right fist connected solidly with Jake's ribs. The blow was perfectly placed and devastatingly effective, driving the air from Jake's lungs and sending him staggering backward. Jake tried to regain his balance and mount some kind of counterattack, but Thomas was already moving again. This time the old man's left hand grabbed Jake's shirt front while his right delivered a short, sharp uppercut to Jake's solar plexus. Jake doubled over, gasping for breath, and Thomas's knee came up to meet his descending face. The impact sent Jake sprawling in the dirt, blood streaming from his nose and his head spinning. He tried to get up, but his body wasn't responding properly. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear Thomas's voice, calm and instructional. "First lesson, boy, don't never assume that an old man is a weak man. I've been fighting longer than you've been alive, and I learn from experts." Jake managed to roll over and push himself up on his hands and knees, spitting blood into the dust. "Point taken," he gasped. "No," Thomas said. "Point not taken yet. You're still thinking like a supervisor instead of like a man. Get up and try again." Jake struggled to his feet, wiping blood from his nose with the back of his hand. "I said point taken. You've made your statement." "Have I?" Thomas tilted his head slightly, like a hawk studying a mouse. "What statement do you think I've made, boy?" Jake took a deep breath, trying to clear his head. "That you don't like being told what to do." Thomas shook his head sadly. "Wrong answer. Try again." Before Jake could respond, Thomas moved forward again, this time more slowly, almost casually. Jake tried to block the older man's approach, but it was like trying to stop flowing water with his bare hands. Thomas slipped past his guard easily, caught Jake's wrist in a grip like iron, and used Jake's own momentum to send him flying face first into the dirt. This time, Jake didn't get up immediately. He lay there for a moment, tasting blood and dust, trying to understand what was happening to him. He'd been in fights before, had always held his own, but this was different. Thomas wasn't just beating him, he was dismantling him piece by piece, like a mechanic taking apart an engine to show an apprentice how it worked. "Second lesson," Thomas said, standing over Jake's prone form. "Fighting isn't about being tough or angry. It's about being smart and patient. You're neither one right now." Jake rolled over and looked up at the old Navajo cowboy. Thomas wasn't even breathing hard, and there wasn't a mark on him. Meanwhile, Jake felt like he'd been trampled by a Mustang. "What do you want from me?" Jake asked, and was ashamed to hear the defeat in his own voice. "I want you to understand something important. I want you to understand that respect works both ways. You want my respect? You need to show me yours first." Jake sat up slowly, his ribs aching where Thomas had hit him. "How do I do that?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Thomas's expression softened slightly. "By listening instead of talking. By asking questions instead of giving orders. By understanding that the land you think you own has been home to my people for 1,000 years, and maybe we know something about it that you don't." Jake nodded, beginning to understand. "The fence. You wanted me to talk to the tribal police because there's more to the story than just someone cutting wire." "Now you're starting to learn," Thomas said approvingly. "That fence wasn't cut by rustlers or trespassers. It was cut by the family that used to live on that land before your boss bought it from the government. They've been grazing their sheep there for 3 generations, and they don't understand why a piece of paper gives someone else the right to keep them away from water their great-grandfather found." Jake struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. "So what do you suggest we do about it?" "We talk to them," Thomas said simply. "We find a solution that works for everybody. We show respect for their history while protecting the ranch's interests. It's not that complicated, boy, but it requires thinking like a human being instead of like a boss." Jake nodded again, feeling something shift inside him. The anger and frustration that had been driving him all morning were gone, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: humility. "Thomas," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." "War chief," Thomas corrected gently. "War chief," Jake repeated. "I owe you an apology. I came out here thinking I knew everything I needed to know, and I was wrong. I treated you with disrespect, and you had every right to call me on it." Thomas studied Jake's face for a long moment, as if looking for something. Whatever he was searching for, he apparently found it, because his stern expression began to relax. "Apology accepted," he said finally. "But understand this, Jake Morrison. This was just the first lesson. You've got a lot more to learn if you want to succeed out here." Jake wiped more blood from his nose and managed a rueful smile. "I'm beginning to figure that out. Think you might be willing to teach me?" Thomas looked around at the other cowboys, who had been watching the entire confrontation in fascinated silence. "What do you boys think? Is he worth teaching, or should we just find ourselves a new foreman?" Tommy Begay was the first to speak. "I think he might be worth the effort, grandfather." Any man who can take a beating like that and still ask for more lessons has something going for him. The other cowboys nodded agreement, and Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the desert sun. For the first time since he'd taken the job, he felt like he might actually belong here. Thomas extended his hand to Jake, and after a moment's hesitation, Jake took it. The old cowboy's grip was firm and warm, and when he smiled this time, it was genuine. "Welcome to the real Rocking T Ranch, Jake Morrison," Thomas said. "Now let's get these cattle where they belong, and then we'll talk about that fence. You've got a lot to learn about the history of this place, and some of it's going to surprise you." As they walked back toward their horses, Jake caught sight of his reflection in the still water of Bitter Creek. His face was swollen and bloody, his shirt was torn, and his hat was covered in dust. He looked like he'd been dragged behind a horse for miles. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. 3 weeks had passed since Jake Morrison's education in the desert, and the young foreman was beginning to understand just how much he didn't know about the land he was supposed to manage. Every morning brought new lessons from Thomas Begay, war chief, as Jake had learned to call him, and each lesson revealed another layer of complexity beneath what had seemed like simple ranch work. The cut fence at Devil's Rock had been just the beginning. Through War Chief's patient guidance, Jake had learned that the Rocking T Ranch sat at the center of a web of historical disputes, territorial claims, and family grievances that stretched back generations. What looked like empty desert to Jake's inexperienced eye was actually a landscape rich with meaning, marked by invisible boundaries that meant more to the local people than any legal survey. Jake had taken War Chief's advice and contacted the tribal police about the fence. The conversation with Officer Maria Yazzie, Sam's sister, it turned out, had been enlightening and humbling. The family cutting the fence wasn't acting out of malice or criminal intent. They were the descendants of Henry Goldtooth, a Navajo shepherd who had grazed his flocks in that area since the 1920s. When the federal government had sold the land to the Rocking T's owner 5 years earlier, no one had bothered to inform the Goldtooth family that their traditional grazing grounds were no longer available to them. "It's a common story out here," Officer Yazzie had explained to Jake during their meeting at the tribal police station. "The government draws lines on maps without understanding what those lines mean to the people who live here. Then someone like you comes along and wonders why folks don't respect boundaries they never agreed to. The solution, when they found it, had been surprisingly simple. The Rocking T Ranch had more land than it could effectively use, and the area around Devil's Rock was marginal grazing at best. Jake had proposed a formal agreement allowing the Goldtooth family to continue grazing their sheep in exchange for helping maintain the water sources in that section. His boss, Richard Tanner, had been skeptical at first but had agreed when Jake explained how the arrangement would save the ranch money on maintenance while building goodwill with their neighbors. The signing of the agreement had taken place on a sunny Tuesday morning at the ranch house with representatives from both families present. Jake had expected a simple business meeting, but what he'd witnessed instead was something approaching a ceremony. War Chief had spoken in Navajo for several minutes before switching to English, talking about the importance of respecting the land and sharing its gifts. Henry Goldtooth's grandson, a man named Jim who was about Jake's age, had responded with his own speech about gratitude and cooperation. When the papers were finally signed, Jim Goldtooth had shaken Jake's hand and said, "You're learning to think like a good neighbor, Morrison." "Your grandfather would have understood." "My grandfather?" Jake had asked, puzzled. "Charlie Morrison," Jim had replied. "Worked for the Indian Service back in the 30s and 40s. He was one of the good ones. Always tried to find fair solutions to problems." You've got his look around the eyes. Jake had been stunned. He'd known his grandfather had worked for the government somewhere in the Southwest, but the family had never talked much about it. After the meeting, War Chief had filled in some of the details. Charlie Morrison was a livestock specialist, the old cowboy had explained as they rode the fence line that afternoon. Government sent him out here to help the Diné improve their sheep and cattle herds after the stock reduction programs of the 30s. Most white officials treated us like children who needed to be managed. Charlie treated us like neighbors who needed to be consulted. "You knew him?" Jake had asked, surprised. "Met him once or twice when I was a young man. He helped my father get better breeding stock for our horses. Always spoke respectfully. Always listened before he talked. I wondered if you might be related when I first heard your name." "Why didn't you say anything?" War Chief had smiled. "Because being Charlie Morrison's grandson doesn't mean anything if you can't live up to his example. Had to see what kind of man you were first." Now, 3 weeks later, Jake was beginning to feel like he might be worthy of his grandfather's reputation. The other cowboys had noticed the change in him, the way he asked questions instead of barking orders, the way he listened to their suggestions about managing the cattle. Tommy Begay had even started calling him boss without the ironic tone he'd used before. But Jake was about to face a test that would challenge everything he'd learned. It started with a phone call on a Thursday morning in late September. Jake was in the ranch office going over the books with Rita, the ranch secretary, when the phone rang. Rita answered it, spoke briefly in Spanish, then handed the receiver to Jake with a worried expression. "It's Sheriff Martinez," she said. "Says it's urgent." Jake took the phone, noting the tension in Rita's voice. Sheriff Eduardo Martinez was an old friend of the ranch, a reasonable man who'd grown up in the area and understood the complexities of border life. If he was calling with urgent business, it meant real trouble. "Morning, Ed. What's the situation?" "Jake, I need you to listen carefully. We've got a problem developing, and you're right in the middle of it. You know anything about a group calling itself the Arizona Border Defense League?" Jake frowned. He'd heard the name mentioned on the news, something about citizen militias patrolling the border to catch illegal immigrants. "Just what I've seen on TV." "Why?" "Because they've set up a camp on your North Range, about 2 miles from the reservation boundary. They're armed, they're organized, and they're causing panic among the families that live in that area." Jake felt his stomach drop. The North Range was isolated and rarely visited, which made it perfect for someone looking to hide illegal activities. But it was also dangerously close to several Navajo family compounds, including the home of War Chief's sister and her grandchildren. "How many of them are there?" Jake asked. "My deputy counted at least 15 vehicles and maybe 30 people when he did a flyover yesterday. They've got tents, communication equipment, and enough firepower to outfit a small army." "What do they claim they're doing?" Sheriff Martinez sighed. "They say they're conducting patriotic border security operations and have every right to be on private land as long as they have the owner's permission. They claim someone from the ranch told them they could use the property." Jake's mind raced. He certainly hadn't given anyone permission, and neither had his boss as far as he knew. "Ed, I never authorized anything like this." "Neither did Mr. Tanner. I figured as much, but I had to ask." "Problem is, they're dug in pretty good, and they're not inclined to listen to reason. Their leader is a guy named Chuck Brennan, some kind of ex-military type who thinks he's fighting a war against the Mexican invasion." Jake had heard of Chuck Brennan. The man had been in the news several times over the past few years, always in connection with armed confrontations along the border. He was the kind of person who attracted followers by offering simple solutions to complex problems, and he had a reputation for not backing down from fights. "What do you need from me, Ed?" "I need you to formally revoke any permission they might claim to have, and I need you to do it in writing so I can serve them with trespass notices." "But Jake," the sheriff's voice grew serious, "you need to understand that this could get ugly fast. These militia types don't like being told to move along, and they especially don't like being told by what they consider to be government agents." Jake glanced at Rita, who had been listening to his end of the conversation with growing alarm. "I'll handle it, Ed. Give me a couple hours to get the paperwork together." "Jake, one more thing. Whatever you do, don't go up there alone. These people are spoiling for a fight and they see enemies everywhere. Take someone with you, someone who knows the country." After hanging up, Jake sat in silence for several minutes, trying to think through his options. The smart thing would be to call his boss, get the lawyers involved, and let the authorities handle the situation. But that would take time, and every hour the militia remained on ranch property increased the danger to the local families. Jake made his decision. He would go to the militia camp himself, with War Chief as backup, and personally deliver the trespass notice. It was risky, but it was also the fastest way to resolve the situation before it escalated further. He found War Chief in the equipment barn, repairing a bridle with the patient skill of a man who'd been working with leather for 60 years. The old cowboy listened without interruption as Jake explained the situation, his weathered face growing increasingly grim. "How long have they been there?" War Chief asked when Jake finished. "Sheriff says at least a few days, maybe longer." War Chief nodded slowly. "My sister mentioned seeing helicopters in that area last week. Thought it might be Border Patrol or drug enforcement. Didn't realize it was something like this. Will you come with me to deliver the notice?" War Chief set down the bridle and looked directly at Jake. "You understand what you're asking, don't you, boy? These militia people don't much like Indians, and they like Indian-loving whites even less. This could go bad in a hurry." "I know. But I can't let them stay on ranch property, and I can't let them threaten your family. This is the right thing to do. War Chief studied Jake's face for a long moment, then smiled the same smile he'd worn just before their fight 3 weeks earlier. But this time, Jake realized, the smile was approving rather than predatory. "All right then," War Chief said. "Give me 10 minutes to get ready." An hour later, Jake and War Chief were driving toward the North Range in Jake's pickup truck, following a rough track that wound through scrub oak and juniper trees. Jake had called Sheriff Martinez to inform him of their plans, and the sheriff had promised to have deputies standing by in case things went wrong. As they approached the militia camp, Jake could smell wood smoke and hear the sound of voices carrying on the still air. War Chief, who had been silent for most of the drive, suddenly held up his hand. "Stop here," he said quietly. "Let's walk in from this point." Jake parked the truck behind a stand of trees and followed War Chief as the older man began making his way carefully through the underbrush. Despite his age, War Chief moved through the terrain with the silent grace of a hunting cat, pausing frequently to listen and observe before proceeding. They crested a small ridge and found themselves looking down into a natural bowl where the militia had established their camp. Jake counted at least 20 tents arranged in military-style rows, with vehicles parked in a defensive perimeter around the outside. Men in camouflage clothing moved between the tents, many of them carrying rifles. At the center of the camp, a large American flag hung from a pole next to a banner that read, "American Sovereignty No Compromise." "Professional setup," War Chief observed quietly. "These aren't weekend warriors playing soldier. They know what they're doing." Jake nodded, feeling his nervousness increase. The camp looked like something from a war movie, complete with sentries and communication antennas. Whatever Chuck Brennan's background, he'd clearly attracted people with real military experience. "Should we go back and wait for more backup?" Jake asked. War Chief shook his head. "Running away now won't solve the problem. Besides, the longer they're here, the more entrenched they'll become. Better to face this while they're still feeling uncertain about their position." They made their way down the ridge toward the camp perimeter, making no attempt to conceal their approach. A sentry spotted them when they were still 50 yards away and called out a challenge. "Hold it right there! State your business." Jake raised his hands to show he wasn't armed. "I'm Jake Morrison, foreman of the Rocking T Ranch. This is my land, and I need to speak with whoever's in charge." The sentry, a young man with close-cropped hair and nervous eyes, kept his rifle pointed in their direction while he spoke into a radio. After a brief conversation, he waved them forward. "Boss wants to see you, but the Indian stays here." War Chief's face didn't change expression, but Jake felt the temperature in the air drop several degrees. "He's my deputy," Jake said firmly. "Where I go, he goes." "Not into this camp, he doesn't," the sentry replied. "We don't allow hostiles inside our perimeter." Jake felt his own temper beginning to rise. "Hostiles? This man is a decorated combat veteran and a respected member of this community. If you've got a problem with Native Americans, that's your ignorance to deal with." Before the situation could escalate further, a new voice cut through the tension. "What seems to be the problem here, Collins?" Jake turned to see a man approaching from the direction of the camp. He was tall and lean, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of bearing that suggested military training. This would be Chuck Brennan, Jake realized, and despite his reputation, the man's voice was calm and reasonable. "Morrison, I presume?" Brennan extended his hand. "Chuck Brennan, Arizona Border Defense League. I understand you have some concerns about our presence here." Jake shook the offered hand, noting Brennan's firm grip and direct gaze. Whatever else he was, the militia leader was clearly intelligent and confident. "That's right, Mr. Brennan. This is private property, and you don't have permission to be here. I'm going to have to ask you to pack up and move along." Brennan smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "I think there might be some confusion here, Mr. Morrison. We received explicit permission to use this location from a representative of the ranch, all perfectly legal and above board." "From who?" Jake demanded. "I'm not at liberty to reveal our source," Brennan replied smoothly. "But I assure you, we have every right to be here." Jake pulled the formal trespass notice from his jacket pocket. "Then you'll have no problem accepting this official revocation of any permission you think you might have had. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises." Brennan's smile faded as he read the document. When he looked up, his eyes were cold and calculating. "This is unfortunate, Mr. Morrison. We're performing vital work here, protecting American citizens from the invasion that's destroying our country. I hoped you'd be more patriotic." "I'm plenty patriotic," Jake replied evenly. "But I'm also a law-abiding citizen who respects property rights. You need to leave. And if we choose not to, then you'll be dealing with the sheriff's department and whatever charges they decide to file." Brennan looked past Jake to where War Chief stood silently observing the conversation. "I see you've brought one of your Indian friends with you. Interesting choice of allies for someone who claims to be patriotic." Jake felt War Chief tense beside him, but the older man remained motionless. "Mr. Begay is my deputy foreman and a decorated veteran who served his country with honor. I'd be careful about questioning his patriotism if I were you." "Served his country?" Brennan laughed harshly. "His country is Mexico, Morrison. All these people are just waiting for the chance to reclaim what they think is theirs. You're too naive to see it, but you're being used." Jake took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You're way out of line, Brennan. I suggest you stop talking and start packing." "Or what?" Brennan's hand moved casually to rest on the pistol holstered at his hip. "You and your Indian friend are going to make us leave?" "I don't think so." The confrontation was escalating rapidly, and Jake realized he needed to defuse the situation before it turned violent. He could see other militia members gathering at the edges of their conversation, drawn by the raised voices and obvious tension. "Mr. Brennan," Jake said, forcing his voice to remain calm, "I'm not looking for a fight. I'm just a ranch foreman, trying to protect his employer's property and maintain good relations with his neighbors. You've got your notice, and you've got 24 hours. What happens after that is up to you." Brennan studied Jake for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well, Mr. Morrison. We'll consider your request, but I want you to understand something. We're here for a good reason. The border is wide open, and every day brings more criminals and terrorists into our communities. Someone has to take a stand." "Then take your stand somewhere else," Jake replied. "This isn't your land, and these aren't your neighbors to protect." As Jake and War Chief walked back toward their truck, Jake could feel hostile eyes watching their retreat. The confrontation had gone better than he'd feared, but he had a sinking feeling that it was far from over. "What do you think?" Jake asked as they drove away from the camp. "I think," War Chief said quietly, "that Mr. Brennan has no intention of leaving voluntarily, and I think he's going to try to make this about more than just trespassing." "What do you mean?" "I mean he's going to try to turn this into a race war. Men like that always do. They can't just be wrong. They have to be victims of some conspiracy. And the easiest conspiracy to sell is the one about Indians and Mexicans trying to steal America back." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. He was beginning to realize that his education in the complexities of life on the border was just beginning, and the next lesson was going to be harder than anything War Chief had taught him so far. The 24-hour deadline came and went without any sign of the militia packing up their camp. Sheriff Martinez called Jake early Friday morning to confirm what they'd both expected. The Arizona Border Defense League had no intention of leaving voluntarily. "Brennan's been busy," the sheriff reported. "He's been on talk radio all morning, spinning this into a story about government oppression and patriotic Americans being persecuted by corrupt officials and their Indian allies. He's also filed some kind of legal injunction claiming they have legitimate authority to remain on the property." Jake rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. What kind of authority could they possibly claim? Something about citizens' arrest powers and pursuit of federal fugitives. It's all nonsense, but it'll tie things up in court for days while his lawyers file motions and appeals. Meanwhile, his people are dug in like ticks. So what are our options? Limited. I can serve them with official trespass notices, but if they resist, I'll need backup from the state police or federal marshals. That could take days to arrange, and there's no guarantee it won't turn into a shooting match. Jake stared out the ranch office window toward the distant mesas where the militia had established their base. He could see smoke from their campfires rising into the clear morning air, a constant reminder that armed strangers were occupying his land and threatening his neighbors. "Ed, what happens if we just wait them out? How long can they realistically stay up there?" "That's the problem, Jake. These groups thrive on confrontation. The longer this drags out, the more supporters Brennan attracts. I've got reports of militia members from 3 different states heading this way to join what they're calling a patriotic stand against government tyranny. This could turn into Ruby Ridge or Waco if we're not careful." The references to those deadly standoffs made Jake's blood run cold. He'd been hoping for a simple resolution to a trespassing problem, but the situation was clearly spinning out of control. I need to think about this, Ed. Can you give me until this afternoon before you take any official action? I can give you a few hours, but not much longer. The tribal chairman is getting pressure from his council to do something about the armed militia threatening reservation families. If I don't act soon, he might decide to handle this his own way. After the sheriff hung up, Jake sat in the quiet office trying to figure out his next move. Every option seemed to lead to escalation and potential violence. He was considering calling his boss when War Chief appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing a grim expression. "Heard you talking to the sheriff," the older man said, handing Jake one of the cups. "Sounds like our militia friends are settling in for a long stay." Jake nodded gratefully and took a sip of the strong black coffee. Brennan's turned this into some kind of political circus. He's got lawyers filing motions and supporters driving in from other states. The sheriff says it could turn into another Ruby Ridge. War Chief settled into the chair across from Jake's desk, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Ruby Ridge," he repeated thoughtfully. "You know what happened there, don't you? Government agents tried to arrest a man who'd failed to appear in court, and it turned into an 11-day siege that left 3 people dead. That's the official version," War Chief said. "The real story is more complicated. Randy Weaver was a white separatist who moved to the mountains of Idaho because he believed the government was controlled by Jews and minorities. When federal agents tried to arrest him, it became a symbol for every angry white man in America who felt like the country was leaving him behind." Jake frowned. "What does that have to do with our situation?" "Everything," War Chief replied. "Chuck Brennan isn't just some random troublemaker who picked our land by accident. He's chosen this spot specifically because it sits between a ranch owned by a white man and a reservation full of Indians. He wants a confrontation, and he especially wants one that makes him look like a defender of white America against the brown hordes. So what do you suggest we do?" War Chief was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if looking for answers in the dark liquid. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and thoughtful. "Tell me something, Jake. What do you know about the Navajo code talkers?" Jake was puzzled by the apparent change of subject. "Just what everyone knows, I guess. Navajo Marines who used their language to send coded messages during World War II. The Japanese never broke their code. That's right. My father was one of them. Spent 3 years in the Pacific fighting for a country that had spent the previous century trying to destroy his people's way of life. You know why he did it? 'Cause it was the right thing to do? Partly, but mostly because he understood something that a lot of people don't. That sometimes you have to fight for the idea of America, even when America hasn't lived up to its ideals for you." War Chief stood up and walked to the window, looking out toward the North Range where the militia camp was hidden beyond the hills. "Chuck Brennan thinks he's a patriot," the old cowboy continued, "but he's not fighting for America. He's fighting for a fantasy version of America that never really existed, a place where white men could do whatever they wanted and everyone else knew their place." "I still don't see where this is leading," Jake said. War Chief turned back to face him, and Jake was surprised to see something that might have been amusement in the older man's eyes. "It's leading to the same place all your lessons have been leading, boy. You can't solve this problem by being the biggest, toughest man on the mountain. You have to be smarter than that." Before Jake could ask what he meant, the office phone rang. Jake answered it to find Rita on the other end, her voice tight with worry. "Mr. Morrison, you need to get down to the main gate right away. There's a television crew here, and they're asking questions about the militia and the ranch's position on border security." Jake closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The media attention Sheriff Martinez had warned about was beginning, and he had no doubt that Chuck Brennan was behind it. "Tell them I'll be right there, Rita. And whatever you do, don't let them pass the gate." Jake and War Chief drove to the ranch entrance to find a news van from a Phoenix television station parked outside the gate, along with a reporter and cameraman who were filming a stand-up report. The reporter, a young woman with carefully styled hair and a serious expression, was explaining to her viewers about the developing standoff between federal authorities and a patriotic militia group. "The controversy centers around this ranch," she was saying, gesturing toward the Rocking T property, "where sources tell us that ranch management initially welcomed the Border Defense League before mysteriously changing their position under pressure from local tribal leaders." Jake felt his temper flare. The reporter was presenting a completely false narrative, one that cast the ranch as either duplicitous or weak. He could see exactly how Brennan was playing this, creating a story that would attract sympathy and support from people who shared his political views. As Jake and War Chief approached the gate, the reporter spotted them and immediately signaled her cameraman to start rolling. She hurried over with her microphone extended. Mr. Morrison. I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 12 News. Can you comment on reports that your ranch initially gave permission for the Arizona Border Defense League to use your property for border security operations? Jake looked directly into the camera, knowing that his next words would probably be broadcast across Arizona within hours. That's completely false. Neither I nor anyone else associated with this ranch gave permission for any militia group to use our property. They are trespassing, and we've asked them to leave. But sources within the militia claim they were invited here by ranch management. Are you saying they're lying? I'm saying they don't have permission to be on our property, and they never did. This is a simple matter of trespassing, not politics. The reporter pressed on, clearly hoping to get him to say something controversial. Some people are saying that your position changed after pressure from tribal leaders who oppose the militia's mission of protecting the border. What's your response to that? Jake felt War Chief's hand touch his arm lightly, a subtle reminder to stay calm and think before speaking. The gesture gave him a moment to consider his words carefully. Walsh. The Rocking T Ranch has always maintained good relationships with all our neighbors, including the local tribal communities. Our decision to ask the militia to leave has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with property rights and public safety. We don't allow unauthorized armed groups on our land, regardless of what they claim to stand for. What about reports that you're working with tribal police to coordinate action against the militia? This was clearly the question the reporter had been building toward, the one designed to support Brennan's narrative about a conspiracy between the ranch and tribal authorities. Jake realized that his answer would either reinforce that story or help dispel it. I work with all local law enforcement agencies when necessary, Jake said calmly. The tribal police, the county sheriff's department, and state authorities are all welcome partners in maintaining peace and security in this area. That's not politics. That's just good neighborliness. The reporter tried a few more questions, but Jake's calm, reasonable responses weren't giving her the confrontational footage she'd obviously been hoping for. Finally, she thanked him and began packing up her equipment. As the news crew drove away, War Chief smiled approvingly. Good job, boy. You didn't let her make you angry, and you didn't say anything that Brennan can use against you. Think it'll help? Some. People watching that report will see a calm, reasonable ranch foreman dealing with a difficult situation. But Brennan's not going to give up just because you handled one reporter well. He'll keep escalating until something gives way. They drove back toward the ranch house in thoughtful silence. But before they reached the main buildings, War Chief asked Jake to pull over at a scenic overlook that provided a view across miles of high desert terrain. See that smoke? War Chief pointed toward a thin column of grey rising from the direction of the militia camp. They're not just camping up there anymore. They're building something permanent. Jake studied the distant smoke through a pair of binoculars he kept in the truck. What he saw made his heart sink. The militia wasn't just maintaining campfires anymore. They were burning brush and clearing land, creating what looked like permanent defensive positions. They're not planning to leave, Jake said. No, they're not. And the longer they stay, the harder they'll be to remove. Brennan's betting that you'll get tired of the negative publicity and just let him stay, or that you'll do something stupid and give him an excuse to claim you attacked patriotic Americans. Jake lowered the binoculars and turned to War Chief. So what do? We can't just let them stay, but we can't force them out without risking people getting killed. War Chief smiled that enigmatic smile again. You're still thinking like a white man, Jake. You're looking for a direct confrontation, either surrender or attack. But sometimes the best way to win a war is to make your enemy defeat himself. I don't understand. You will. But first, we need to gather some intelligence about what they're really doing up there. And I know just the person to help us with that. An hour later, Jake found himself following War Chief through rough country toward a small house tucked into a canyon about 3 miles from the militia camp. The house belonged to War Chief's nephew, Danny Begay, a man in his 30s who worked as a hunting guide and knew the surrounding terrain better than anyone. Danny was waiting for them on his front porch, cleaning a rifle with the methodical patience of someone who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death in harsh country. Uncle, Danny said in greeting, then nodded to Jake. Morrison. Danny, we need your help, War Chief said without preamble. Those militia people up on the North Range, we need to know exactly what they're doing up there. Danny set down his rifle and studied both men carefully. You want me to scout them? Just observe, War Chief clarified. We need to know how many people, what kind of weapons, what they're building.
But I don't want you taking any risks or getting too close.
Already done some of that, Danny admitted. Those people have been making enough noise to scare every deer and elk within 10 miles. Hard to ignore them when they're disrupting the natural balance. What did you see? More than 30 people now, maybe 40. They've got military-style tents, communication equipment, and enough guns to outfit a small army. But here's the interesting part. They're not just watching the border. They've got observation posts facing toward the reservation. Jake felt a chill. They're watching the tribal lands? That's right. And they're taking photographs of anyone who comes and goes. Yesterday, I saw them following a tribal police patrol with binoculars, taking notes about their routes and schedules. War Chief's expression darkened. They're gathering intelligence for future operations. This isn't just about border security. They're planning something against the tribe. Danny nodded grimly. There's more. I heard them talking about known tribal agitators and making lists of people they consider threats to American security. Your name came up, Uncle, and so did yours, Morrison. Jake felt his stomach clench. The situation was far worse than he'd realized. Brennan wasn't just occupying ranch property. He was conducting surveillance operations against American citizens and making target lists. Danny, War Chief said quietly, would you be willing to testify to federal authorities about what you've observed? If it'll help get rid of these people? Yes. But Uncle, you need to understand, some of the younger men on the reservation are getting restless. They don't like the idea of armed whites spying on their families. There's talk of organizing patrols of their own. That's exactly what Brennan wants, Jake said, understanding flooding through him. He wants the tribe to do something that he can portray as an attack on American citizens. Then he becomes the victim instead of the aggressor. War Chief nodded approvingly. Now you're starting to think like a strategist instead of just a ranch foreman. Brennan's entire plan depends on provoking a reaction that makes him look like the good guy. So what do we do? Jake was quiet for a long moment, an idea beginning to form in his mind. It was risky and would require perfect timing, but it might be the key to resolving the crisis without violence. We give him what he wants, Jake said finally, but not the way he expects to get it. 2 days later, Jake was back at the ranch office making phone calls to reporters, politicians, and anyone else who might be interested in the story of the Arizona Border Defense League. But instead of trying to minimize media attention, he was actively courting it. The strategy War Chief had helped him develop was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of fighting Brennan's narrative, they would embrace it and push it to its logical conclusion. If Brennan wanted to be seen as a patriotic defender of America, then they would give him every opportunity to demonstrate exactly what his version of patriotism looked like. Jake's first call was to Jennifer Walsh, the reporter who'd interviewed him at the ranch gate. Walsh, this is Jake Morrison from the Rocking T Ranch. I wanted to follow up on your story about the militia situation. Mr. Morrison, has there been a new development? Yes, there has. I've decided to invite media representatives to tour the militia camp and see for themselves what the Arizona Border Defense League is doing on our property. I think the American people deserve to know the truth about these self-proclaimed patriots. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Are you sure about this, Mr. Morrison? From what I understand, the militia leadership hasn't been particularly welcoming to outside observers. That's why I'm extending the invitation personally, as the property owner. Tomorrow at noon, I'll be leading a group of journalists up to their camp to see what Chuck Brennan's people are really doing in the name of border security. Jake made similar calls to newspapers, radio stations, and television news departments across Arizona and the Southwest. By evening, he'd received confirmations from more than a dozen media outlets, including national networks that had been following the story. The next morning dawned clear and hot, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant mountains look close enough to touch. Jake and War Chief met the assembled journalists at the ranch gate, a group that included not only local reporters but also correspondents from major news networks and newspapers. Ladies and gentlemen, Jake addressed the group, I want to thank you for coming out this morning. As you know, an armed militia group calling itself the Arizona Border Defense League has been occupying private ranch property for more than a week now, despite being asked to leave. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what they're doing on our land. The caravan of news vehicles followed Jake's pickup truck along the rough track toward the North Range, with War Chief riding silently in the passenger seat. As they approached the militia camp, Jake could see sentries scrambling to alert their leadership about the approaching convoy. By the time the vehicles reached the camp perimeter, Chuck Brennan was waiting with several of his lieutenants. The militia leader's face was flushed with anger, but he was clearly trying to maintain his composure in front of the cameras. "Morrison!" Brennan called out as Jake stepped out of his truck. "What's the meaning of this circus?" "Just giving the American people a chance to see what patriotic border security looks like," Jake replied calmly, noting that the cameras were already rolling. "Since you claim to be defending our country, I thought you'd be proud to show off your operation." Brennan looked trapped. He couldn't refuse to talk to the media without looking like he had something to hide, but he also clearly hadn't expected to have his camp invaded by journalists. "We're conducting legitimate security operations," Brennan said stiffly. "We have every right to be here." "Of course you do," Jake agreed amiably. "So why don't you show these reporters around? Let them see the important work you're doing to protect America from the invasion." For the next hour, Jake watched with growing satisfaction as Brennan was forced to give interviews and tours that revealed the true nature of his operation. The journalists asked pointed questions about the surveillance equipment pointed toward the reservation, the target lists Danny Begay had described, and the legal authority for citizen militias to conduct military-style operations on private property. Under pressure from experienced reporters, Brennan's carefully constructed persona began to crack. His reasonable tone gave way to angry rants about racial conspiracies and government betrayal. His claims of legitimate law enforcement authority crumbled under questioning about specific legal statutes and jurisdictional limits. The breaking point came when a reporter from the Phoenix newspaper asked about the militia's intelligence-gathering activities directed at local tribal communities. "We're monitoring potential security threats," Brennan snapped, no longer bothering to maintain his diplomatic facade. "These people have divided loyalties, and they're being used by Mexican drug cartels and international terrorists to undermine American sovereignty." "What evidence do you have of that?" the reporter pressed. "I don't have to provide evidence to the liberal media," Brennan shot back. "Real Americans know what's happening in their own country, even if you people refuse to report the truth." Jake exchanged a glance with War Chief, who nodded almost imperceptibly. The trap had worked perfectly. In front of multiple cameras and reporters, Chuck Brennan had revealed himself to be exactly what he was, not a patriotic defender of America, but a paranoid extremist who saw enemies everywhere and had appointed himself judge, jury, and potential executioner. The interviews continued for another hour, with Brennan becoming increasingly agitated and his followers growing visibly uncomfortable with the negative attention. Finally, the militia leader had had enough. "That's it," he shouted, pushing past a reporter who was asking about his group's funding sources. "This interview is over. Everyone off this property right now." "Actually," Jake said quietly, "this is still my property, Mr. Brennan. And I think these journalists should be able to finish their work." Brennan spun around to face Jake, his face red with fury. "Your property? You sold out to the Indians and the federal government. You're a traitor to your own race." The racist outburst was captured by every camera present, and Jake saw several reporters scribbling notes furiously. Brennan had just destroyed any claim to legitimacy he might have had. "I think," Jake said calmly, "that you've shown everyone exactly what kind of patriot you are, Mr. Brennan. Thank you for the demonstration." As the media convoy prepared to leave, Jake noticed that several militia members were packing their personal gear and loading it into vehicles. The smart ones, he realized, were abandoning Brennan before his extremism dragged them down with him. War Chief climbed back into Jake's truck with a satisfied expression. "How do you think that went, boy?" "Better than I hoped," Jake admitted. "Brennan just destroyed his own credibility on national television. And more importantly, he showed everyone watching that his version of patriotism is really just racism with a flag wrapped around it. That's not going to play well with most Americans." They were right. The news reports that aired that evening portrayed Chuck Brennan and his militia as exactly what they were: armed extremists who had occupied private property without permission and were conducting surveillance operations against law-abiding American citizens. The racist rants and conspiracy theories that had emerged during the interviews made it impossible for mainstream media outlets to portray them sympathetically. Within 48 hours, the Arizona Border Defense League began to disintegrate. Faced with universally negative media coverage and potential federal prosecution for civil rights violations, most of Brennan's followers quietly packed up and went home. The few hardcore believers who remained were easily removed by federal marshals, who arrived with valid warrants and overwhelming force. Chuck Brennan himself was arrested on charges of trespassing, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and illegal surveillance of American citizens. The investigation that followed revealed connections to other extremist groups and evidence of plans for future operations against tribal communities throughout the Southwest. A week after the militia's departure, Jake and War Chief rode through the former campsite, surveying the damage and planning cleanup operations. The desert was already beginning to reclaim the cleared areas, with weeds sprouting through the abandoned fire rings and wind starting to erase the tire tracks. "You know what the most important lesson in all this was?" War Chief asked as they sat their horses at the edge of the ridge overlooking the site. "That sometimes the best way to fight an enemy is to let him defeat himself." "That's part of it," War Chief agreed. "But the bigger lesson is about what real patriotism looks like." Chuck Brennan thought patriotism meant hating anyone who was different and using violence to get your way. But my father, who fought in World War II for a country that had tried to destroy his people's culture, understood something Brennan never did. What's that? That America isn't great because it's perfect. America is great because it keeps trying to live up to its ideals, even when that's hard, even when it means admitting you were wrong and changing course. Jake nodded, thinking about his own journey over the past month. When he'd first arrived at the Rocking T, he'd thought leadership meant giving orders and demanding obedience. War Chief had taught him that real leadership meant listening, learning, and earning the respect of the people you worked with. "Speaking of changing course," Jake said, "I owe you an apology, War Chief. When I first got here, I thought I knew everything I needed to know about running a ranch. I was wrong about a lot of things." War Chief smiled, and this time it was warm and genuine. "Apology accepted, Jake Morrison. But you know what? Your grandfather would be proud of how you handled this situation. You learned to think like a good neighbor instead of just a boss." As they rode back toward the ranch house, Jake reflected on everything that had happened since that first confrontation in the desert. He'd learned about history and politics, about respect and leadership, about the complex relationships that bound together the communities of the borderlands. But most importantly, he'd learned that being a good American meant more than just waving a flag. It meant living up to the values that flag was supposed to represent. The old Navajo warrior had stopped smiling that day because he'd seen another young white man who thought authority meant power over others. But by the end of their journey together, War Chief was smiling again because he'd helped create something better. A leader who understood that real strength came from bringing people together instead of driving them apart. That evening, as Jake sat on the ranch house porch watching the sun set over the mesas, he thought about his grandfather Charlie Morrison and the legacy of respect and cooperation he'd left behind. It was a legacy worth living up to, Jake realized. And with War Chief's guidance, maybe he finally could.